Well, all right, let's open our Bibles to the book of Daniel. We are in the 8th chapter. Now, you remember that in chapter 7, Daniel was taken to the end of time by what he said was a dream and vision. It's very interesting the way that he said that. And coming to the time of the end, it was revealed to him that there would be 4 powers. There would be these 4 kingdoms, and out of this 4th kingdom would come the personality that you and I oftentimes refer to as being the Antichrist. Now, all of these writers of prophecy, whether you're talking about Ezekiel or Zechariah or Daniel or even the Apostle John, they all saw the same thing. They had a little bit different perspective. They had a little bit different take on it, seeing it from a little bit different angle. They're all seeing the same things. Now, from Daniel's perspective, he saw that there were going to be these 4 beasts, and these 4 powers were represented by these 4 beasts. Now, Zechariah, he has it, he says it this way. He says, "Now therefore, thus says the Lord, I am returning to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it, says the Lord of hosts, and a surveyor's line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. And then I looked up and I saw 4 horns. And I said to the angel who talked with me, what are these? And so he answered me, these are the horns that have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. So it's interesting that his perspective is not that there are going to be these 4 beasts, but there were these 4 horns. Well, what are these horns? Well, these are these powers that have hassled, that have molested the children of Israel, if you will. Now, you remember that the first thing that Daniel saw, he saw a lion that had these eagle's wings, and this lion was lifted up. Now, people are so very quick to say, see, that's Babylon. Because in Jeremiah chapter 48, and again in Jeremiah chapter 50, it says that Babylon is both a lion as well as an eagle. Well, the problem that you get into is that when you go to Ezekiel 17 and Ezekiel 32, it speaks of Egypt as being a lion and being an eagle. So I could say, well, I got just as much authority to say that it's Egypt as you do Babylon. Now here's the interesting thing. This lion, you remember, was lifted up. His heart was changed. There was a change that took place in this lion. Now, the great Persian king Cyrus in Isaiah chapter 45 in verse 13 said, of Cyrus the Lord says, I have raised him up in righteousness. God did a work in the king of Persia's life. Now, we see eagle's wings related to the nation of Israel a number of times in Scripture, and I believe that it is a picture of Israel being taken out of Persia, allowed to repatriate the promised land. You remember that they were taken by Babylon. Babylon has been defeated by the Persians, and so the Persians have inherited the Jewish problem. And now Cyrus comes along, and Cyrus will say to Israel, hey, go back. Just go back. You're free. Go back, repatriate the land, build the city, build your temple, whatever. You remember that in Revelation chapter 12, in verse 14, and the woman, speaking of Israel, were given 2 wings. To the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness. You remember that in Exodus chapter 19, we read, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I carried you on eagle's wings, and I brought you unto myself. So I believe that this first beast that Daniel sees is figurative for Persia. And it was the work that God did in Cyrus's heart, in changing the man's heart, and then allowing Israel to go back into the land. Next, you remember, was the bear. And this bear was lifted up on one side. This bear was ready to strike with its raised paw. I believe that this is speaking of Alexander the Great, who knew nothing but war, and that the 3 ribs in his mouth represented the 3 victories that he had over Persia. He destroyed Persia in 3 battles. You remember that there was a voice that said to this bear, devour much flesh. Now think about this. Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Genghis Khan, they all experienced losses in war. Alexander the Great never experienced one loss. He started war when he was 20 years of age. For the next 12 years, he spread his kingdom all the way to India. And through those 12 years of nothing but war, there was never one single defeat. You can understand why he said, devour much flesh. Now, coming after the bear, you remember that he saw then this leopard with 4 heads, 4 wings, and this, of course, smoothly fits into that transition that took place after Alexander the Great, that his kingdom was divided between his 4 generals, Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, and Lysimachus. And all of them had a share, and they never attained the greatness that Alexander the Great, of course, had. Now, I believe that what Daniel saw was, look, in the last days, just before the Lord returns, I believe that you're going to see these various powers there in the Mideast. You're going to see Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, Syria, Egypt. All of these are going to be vying for power. All of these are going to be harassing the children of Israel. And then out of one of these, now when we get to chapter 11, we're going to discover that it is out of the Seleucid Empire that the Antichrist is going to arise from. It's going to be out of the land of Turkey, Syria, Iraq. Out of one of those regions is where this world leader is going to come from. Now, why should we believe what Daniel is telling us? Why should we have any confidence that what this guy saw is legitimate? Well, what we have in chapter 8 is that it's history for us, but it was in the future for Daniel. And Daniel is going to be looking out ahead now 200-300 years into the future. And he's going to nail it perfectly. And so if he was dead on 200-300 years out in front, then I think that it should give him some street cred, that we should believe that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to these kingdoms right before the return of the Messiah. So let's look at what he has to say now. Beginning in verse 1, he says that it was in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me for the first time. Now notice the timing of this. You remember chapter 7, verse 1 began that it was in the 1st year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So that means that there's 2 years now in between chapter 7 and chapter 8. And so, again, it's history for us. We can look back and we say, man, that guy nailed it. But yet, it's future for him concerning this vision. So in verse 2, he said, I saw in the vision, and it so happened that while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, in the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Now, he is taken, he's in Babylon because he is still under the authority of the Babylonian king. He is now taken south and east to Shushan, which was the capital of the Persian Empire. See, Persia has not risen yet. He's still under Babylon. Babylon is still calling the shots, so he is in the city of Babylon. So now, in this vision, he ends up in the capital city of the Persian Empire. Now, Persia is going to be a major player here in chapter 8, so it would seem appropriate that this is where he would be taken now to see this vision. This is the very same location where the story of Esther unfolds. Remember that Esther, she is under a Persian king there in the city of Shushan. Now, he says in this vision that I lifted up my eyes and I saw, and there was standing beside the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. so that no animal could stand against him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And then he came to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moved with rage against him and attacked the ram and broke his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to withstand him. And he cast him down to the ground, and he trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore, the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. And in place of it was four notable ones. They came up towards the four winds of heaven. So in this vision, this guy, he's by this river, and the first thing that he sees now is this ram that's got these two horns. Now, it's interesting that he says now that one horn was higher than the other. Now, we're going to be told here by the angel Gabriel that this is the Medo-Persian Empire. So look, we're not speculating here. We're not guessing, not taking a stab in the dark. We have it on good authority that this ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, the Medes came along first, and they were very powerful, but then it was Persia that began to grow in strength. And so they came up second, but they ended up having more power than the Medes, just like he sees here. Now, it's interesting that it says that they move west, and they move north, and they move south. The Persian Empire never went east. They either went north, they either went west, or they went south, just like his vision here. Now, it's also interesting as he's watching this very impressive ram, then all of a sudden, out of the west, comes this goat that we're going to be told here in just a moment is Greece. And of course, their great king was Alexander the Great. And this thing is just screaming. I mean, this baby is above the earth. He's moving incredibly fast. And it's interesting that this large horn was broken. Fascinating that it was broken, but it wasn't broken by another animal. Alexander the Great was not defeated. Alexander the Great, he took over the army at age 20. For the next 12 years, it was nothing but war. He finally ends up in Babylon. There's a bit of a mystery as to why he died. Some think he was poisoned. Some think, well, it was pneumonia or, some other disease. We don't know. But he wasn't defeated, all right? And in this dream, this horn is broken, but not broken by any other beast. And then out of the broken horn, then come these four generals, these four pieces. Now, notice in verse 4 or verse 9, then something very interesting happens. He says, and out of one of them came a little horn. Now, we had that little horn there in chapter 7, didn't we? A big troublemaker. So here we got this little horn that grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east, and toward the glorious land, or toward the land of Israel, toward the promised land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down because of transgression. An army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. And he cast truth down to the ground, and he did all of this and prospered. Very interesting. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, and the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said unto me, 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Very interesting. So he sees now these four horns, and they grew up, Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And now out of one of these, now we know who he's talking about. He came out of the Seleucid Empire, a guy by the name of Antiochus IV. Now, Antiochus took the name Epiphanes unto himself, which means illustrious deity or illustrious God. Again, this is a very unstable individual if he promotes himself being a man, and yet he promotes himself as being a God. It's interesting that the Jews called him Epimanes, which means a madman. And truly, you are a madman if you believe that you are God. It's also interesting that Antiochus IV, that he only went east and he only went south when he, again, just like the prophecy that we have here. Now, what he did is that he moved in to the nation of Israel. He finally conquered the city, and he overturned Judaism. And in fact, Josephus, the historian, tells us, now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking of the city or with its privilege or with the great slaughter which he had made there, but being overcome with his violent passions and remembering what he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to keep their infants uncircumcised and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and most approved among them were put to death. So this guy moves in and he says, all right, you're not going to follow your God any longer. You're going to follow me. I don't want you circumcising your kids. We're not going to be doing all of these sacrifices. In fact, we're going to sacrifice a hog on that altar there. He deposed the high priest. He put his own guy as high priest. He put his own guys in charge there. Just totally turned Jerusalem completely upside down. And then he set his sights on the country of Egypt. Now, notice what happens here in verse 15. And it happened that when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood by me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near unto me where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid. And I fell on my face, and he said, understand, son of man, the vision refers to the end of time. All right, now, we had, remember Gabriel. We had Gabriel in our study in the book of Exodus. Remember, Gabriel, he's wound a little tight, isn't he? I mean, Gabriel is an interesting guy. And so for whatever reason now, he shows up here to give Daniel insight. Now, Daniel is a man who is not afraid to be thrown into a lion's den. And yet this guy comes close to Daniel, and the man that's not afraid of a lion's den is suddenly now afraid of this guy. And we got these images of these fat little babies with wings. They're angels. And I think that we're going to be totally shocked when we see these guys face to face. Apparently, Gabriel is scarier than a pit full of lions, right? And so he hits the ground. He hits the deck. That's what you do when you're afraid, isn't it? And so this guy, grabs, get up. What are you doing here? Now, what is about to happens as a result of prayer. What did we just read? That I, Daniel, when I saw the vision, and I was seeking the meaning of it. Now, that word for seek, it means the idea to pursue after, to desire. What did Jesus say? Ask, seek, and knock, all right? If you want to find, ask, seek, and knock. And so that's what he was doing in prayer. He's had this vision. Lord, what in the world does this mean? And now, all of a sudden, in response to that, Gabriel shows up, and Gabriel is now going to tell him what it means. And so in verse 20, or verse 8, notice that it said that this is to the time of the end. And he says in verse 18, he says, now, as he was speaking unto me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me, and he stood me up, and he said, look. I am making known unto you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, and for the appointed time of the end shall be. Look, dude, quit sleeping in class. Would you get up? All right. Now look, take it easy. The guy's about 80 years old, right? And again, you remember that this is the same guy when he was talking to Zacharias about, you're going to have a son, and I want you to name him John. And you remember, Zacharias said, well, how will I know that these things shall be? He says, look, dude, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. You know what? I'm going to have you, I'm going to take away your ability to speak until after the child. I mean, Gabriel is nobody to be messing with. And so he just grabs this old dude, picks him up off the ground. Look, I'm talking to you, no sleeping in class, all right? And he says, now notice twice, he says at the end of verse 17, and now at the end of verse 19, notice that this is about the end. This is about what's going to happen at the end. So we believe that there is a near and there is a far fulfillment. The near fulfillment is Antiochus Epiphanes. The distant fulfillment is going to be that we will see take place under the Antichrist. Well, then in verse 20, he gets to the description of this vision. He says, the ram that you saw, having two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. There, we got it, all right? We don't have to guess. It's no speculation. Medes and the Persians. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn between its eyes is that first king, of course, Alexander the Great. And as for the broken horns and the four that stood, the broken horn and the four that stood in his place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with his power. Those 4 guys, they are not going to come close to what Alexander the Great was. And in the latter time, their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise with fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. There's another power at work behind this guy. And he shall destroy fearfully. And notice, this is the second time we've had this now. And prosper and thrive. And he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Now notice twice, he's made mention now that this guy is going to prosper. This guy's a bad guy. And yet this guy is going to prosper. This guy's going to kill holy people. And yet, killing holy people, he still prospers. I mean, we got this idea that, if you live right, you do everything right, boy, you're going to prosper. Well, that's not the story of Scripture. Sometimes the good people go from struggle to struggle to struggle. And sometimes the evil people go from blessing to blessing to blessing. I mean, that's the whole thing with Asaph in Psalm 73. I'm seeing my rotten neighbor down the street doing everything wrong, and yet, God, you seem to be blessing him. And here I am working my fingers to the bone for your glory, I thought. And it's going from bad to worse. Well, this happens from time to time. And so he says now that he comes against now these holy people. So here is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great for 12 years. He goes all the way to the border of India. I mean, he just, finally his army says, look, we're done. All right, we're just done. We're tired. We want to go home. All right, let's go home. And he makes it as far as Babylon, and there he dies. Imagine that. You're 32 years old. 32 years old. And you own the world. 32, and you own the world. But what happens? You die. You die. It's good for us to remember. You can have the whole world, but you know what? You're going to die. How does the rich man die? Solomon asks. Just like the poor man, all right? And it's good for us to constantly be reminding ourselves the end is coming our way for each and every one of us. So this gets destroyed now, and these 4 horns rise up. Now notice that what happens here is that this Antiochus Epiphanes, that he leaves. He leaves Jerusalem and he heads now towards Egypt. And on his way to Egypt, he is cut off at the pass by Rome. All right, Rome thought it's probably not in their best interest to allow Antiochus to conquer Egypt. So they sent a fleet of ships down there to head him off the pass. Now, notice verse 25, that through cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper. Here we've got it a third time now, under his rule. And he shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity. And he shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Therefore now seal up the vision, for it refers to many days that are in the future. So here's what happens. Now Antiochus is heading down there, and now this group from Rome head him off of the pass. It was a guy by the name of Papilius, and he says to Antiochus, go home, go home. Now, when you think that you are a god, usually you don't receive that very well when somebody tells you to go home, right? You usually don't receive anything very well when somebody is trying to tell you what to do. So he wants to play it cool before his guys and the Romans, and so he says, well, I'll think about it. And with that, Papilius, he draws a circle in the sand around him and says, take all the time you want, but I want an answer before you leave the circle. And he thought better, and he broke off his attack of Egypt. And now there's a perfect storm that's beginning to brew here, because now he has been embarrassed in front of his army by Rome, and there has been a rumor that has made its way to Jerusalem. And the rumor was that Antiochus was killed. No, Antiochus was confronted. He wasn't killed. And the Jews believed that he was killed, and so what they did is they got rid of all the guys that he put in power. And they cleaned up the temple, and they reinstituted all of their laws and all of their rules. And now when Antiochus gets back, it's one thing to be disrespected by Rome. It's quite another thing to be disrespected by these loser Jews. And he went crazy. He butchered thousands and thousands. He had the women that had circumcised their little babies bring their babies, and he killed their babies in front of the mothers, and then he tied their dead bodies around the mothers' necks and made them wear them for several days, and then he eventually then killed the mothers. He slaughtered all kinds of hogs there in the Temple Mount, smeared it over every square inch of the temple, and making the thing completely unclean. And of course, then eventually he pulls out of Jerusalem. And then it's interesting that he dies for some unknown reason. Now, isn't it interesting that you back up, we're told that the angel was asked, how long will it be until the temple will be cleansed? And it was 2,300 days. What's fascinating is Antiochus' persecution began in earnest December 171 BC. Of course, it was cleansed, finally cleansed on Hanukkah, December 25th, 165 BC, which is 2,300 days, just as Daniel said. Now, notice that again, that Gabriel said that, look, this is many days in the future. You see, what we have here is a mirrored image of Antichrist. There is a near and there is a far fulfillment. The near fulfillment is Antiochus. The far fulfillment is Antichrist. We're going to be told in chapter 11 that Antichrist is going to go into Egypt. He's going to go into North Africa. He's going to hear unsettling tidings out of the north and out of the east, which will cause him to retreat. He's going to be very upset about that, and he's going to end up in Jerusalem, and no doubt that is where we're going to find what Daniel will tell us in chapter 9, the abomination of desolation and the whole beginning of that tribulation period. Now, notice then how Daniel closes this in verse 27. And I, Daniel, I fainted, and I was sick now for days. Afterwards, I arose, and I went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. So it's interesting that he seemed to have had kind of a physiological response. We're going to see this one other time when we get into chapter 10, that apparently whenever Daniel has these close encounters, that it does affect him physically. Now, I think that there's a couple of takeaways here. I think takeaway number one is that, look, if Daniel was so accurate in describing what was going to happen 200-300 years down the road between Persia and Greece, I think that it gives us great confidence that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the last days just before the coming of the Messiah. That there are going to be these four powers. They're going to be centered around Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt. Look, there is not going to be this revived Roman Empire that you hear so many people talk about. This is going to be a Mid-Eastern issue, and out of one of these Muslim powers is going to arise this little horn that is going to go after North Africa, and then is going to be forced to turn around, is going to end up in Jerusalem, and all kinds of incredible things are going to happen. And it is at that point that Jesus says, if you're around and you see these things come down, get out of Dodge as fast as you can. I think that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is that, notice, this guy has been given these incredible visions, but what does he do? He goes back to work. He goes back to work. Isn't that interesting? That here's a guy, he has had some of the most incredible spiritual experiences that any human being could have. He has a physiological response. It's just zapped him. It's laid him out for several days. And then what does he do? He gets back up and he goes to work. And again, I want us to understand that that's what spiritual people do. Somewhere along the line, we got this idea that being spiritual means being weird. You know, if the weirder you are, the more spiritual you are. No. The more spiritual you are, the more responsible you're going to be. A spiritual person goes to work on time. A spiritual person pays their bills. A spiritual person takes care of their families. A spiritual person is a responsible person, and that is exactly what we see in Daniel. Incredible Pentecostal experiences the man is having, and yet he is very practical and very responsible at the very same time. So I think that as we go to prayer, I think that we need to be praying that, first of all, we'd keep our eyes on Palestine, that we would keep our eyes on the fact that this world is not going to end well. This world is going to end violently. This world is going to melt away with a fervent heat. Therefore, what manner of people ought we to be? So we need to be keeping our eye on the end. And then second of all, I think we need to be praying that the Lord would make us responsible, that the Lord would make us mature, and the Lord would make us great witnesses for the cause of Christ.